Good afternoon and welcome to this week's Capitol View webcast at djournal.com, where we talk state politics every Monday afternoon. As always, we are joined by Daily Journal Capitol Bureau Chief Bobby Harrison. I am Chris Kiefer, Managing Editor for Multimedia here at the Daily Journal, and we've got a number of topics we're going to hit on today. We're going to look at the politics of the state transportation, a possible vote that could raise the gas tax and use the money for transportation, and we'll talk a little bit about the politics behind that, as well as some positions of Governor Phil Bryant that came out from his recent budget proposal. We talked a bit about the budget proposal last week. We're going to talk a little bit about some comments he made regarding this, or didn't make, I guess, but his stance on the state lottery, as well as on kind of saving some money and how much of the state budget to spend. But we'll get into that. But first, we've kind of got a wild story. You wouldn't necessarily think talking about a governor's portrait would sound like that interesting a story, but Bobby had a story in Sunday's paper about Bill Allain, former governor from 1984 to 1988, and almost 30 years after he was governor, he's the only governor that doesn't have a portrait in the state capitol, and a couple of Northeast Mississippians have been trying to help him get that. So we'll turn it over to Bobby. First of all, Bobby, how's it going today?
All right, Chris, how you doing?
Good, doing well.
Yeah, you have a good Thanksgiving?
Yeah, I sure did. Like I guess we mentioned last week, I was down in your neck of the woods in Jackson, or in Brandon, I guess, really. But my wife's parents live down there, and we had a good time. It's just relaxing to get away for a little bit. How about yourself?
Good. I just got to get out and get your Christmas present, and then everything will be all right.
Yeah, I hear you. That time of year.
Yeah. Oh,
well, yeah, no, you're good. I did too long of an intro. Yeah, tell us about this story about Bill Allain, and I guess we'll start off. Why has he not had a governor's portrait after all this time, and how rare is that?
Well, he's the only one going. I mean, I know all the people who served as governor since Mississippi was a state, and of course, we're celebrating our 200th anniversary this year. So there's been a number of governors. I think we're on. I think Governor Allain would have been the 59th governor, 59th or 60th, maybe 60th governor. But he's the only one that doesn't have a portrait. Down, all the portraits are on display on the first floor of the state capitol, what they call it, the Hall of Governors. And there's an open space between Ray Mavis and William Winter for Bill Allain's portrait. Normally those portraits are done at the end of a term when the governor's leaving office, but he chose not to have one done. And he never did get one done. He died in 2013 without a portrait being painted. But as it turned out, he kind of, by the time according to sources, by the time he was near the end of his life, he had kind of agreed that it was important he get a portrait done. And so he picked out a photograph to be used for the portrait, but it still hadn't, it still was nothing done until sort of Brandon Presley from Nettleton, who is, of course, the Northern District Public Service Commissioner, kind of got the ball rolling. He was taking, he was taking some oil painting classes from a lady in Pontotoc named Robbie Boyd, who is kind of well-known artist, not only in Northeast Mississippi, but maybe throughout the state. Her family's owned a floral business, or did own a floral business for years in Tupelo. But she was giving Brandon Presley artist lessons, or painting lessons, oil painting lessons. And he brought up the fact about Governor Allain and asked if she'd be willing to do the portrait. And she said she would, and he called the Department of Archives and History and kind of got the ball rolling. And as it turned out, there was money that set aside for each governor to have his portrait done, and so she did it based on that photograph. And she said actually there wasn't a lot of other photographs to look at in terms of getting an indication of some of the characteristics of Governor Allain, but she had to rely a lot on that one photograph, because apparently besides not wanting his portrait done, Governor Allain didn't get a lot of pictures taken. So, but she got the painting done. Brandon Presley has seen it. He's very impressed with it, and the Department of Archives and History has it now. And it's going to be installed in the Capitol, I think, on January 29th, Chris. So it's kind of a neat story. Governor Allain was governor from '84 to '88. before he was governor of Mississippi. He was the state attorney general. He's from Natchez. But he was kind of an unusual politician. He was more reclusive,
like
and just Presley talked about how frugal he was, and really disdained spending money. And so for a number of reasons, maybe because of his reclusive nature and also his frugal nature, he just never got a portrait done. But now there's going to be one done. So all the governors will be installed, and portraits will be installed in the Capitol, up to Phil Bryant, who I assume by the time he leaves office at the early in 2020, there'll be a portrait unveiled of him to also go up.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting. His personality and his, the kind of politician he was. You had a quote in your story from Brandon Presley that said, people used to say he and the staff ate peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in the governor's mansion instead of filet mignon and shrimp. People complained when they came in and there was no food in the governor's mansion, but there was money in the treasury. I mean, it's such a great, colorful quote. And I guess I didn't know Bill Allain. And I guess you'd have been governor, obviously, before you were in that position. But, I mean, what are some of your memories or stories, or, was he just a really unique individual?
Yeah, he was viewed. I mean, he was, he didn't, after he left office, he wasn't in the limelight too often, but he did. He was viewed as I understand it, a pretty impressive or knowledgeable constitutional attorney. So even though he wasn't in the limelight, he did spend a lot of time in the Attorney General's office, helping them with opinions and stuff. He was a former Attorney General, and it was interesting. Presley, who was, got to know Governor Allain when he was just a kid, 23, 22 years old, working on the Amy Tuck first campaign for lieutenant governor in when would that have been, in 1999? At that same time period, he was also helping out with Jim Roberts, ran from Pontotoc, former Supreme Court justice, now a circuit judge, I guess, over in Pontotoc. He ran for governor on the Democratic side, lost that campaign in '99, and Brandon also helped out on that campaign. And both Presley and Allain was sort of helping out on those campaigns. That's when Presley got to know Allain, and Presley, and Presley credits Allain with talking him into running for for mayor of his hometown, Nettleton. And Presley was elected mayor of Nettleton at age 23. And Presley says that Governor Allain sort of kept counsel with him after that. And always, he said, Governor Allain really stressed the importance of open meetings and open government. And I guess the primary accomplishment of Governor Allain occurred when he was Attorney General. Before at that time, all the boards and commissions that controlled, ran the state agencies, not big agencies, they were legislators would be members of those boards and commissions, and by doing so, they were actually in the legislative and the executive branches of government. And any ninth grade civics student who pays attention knows you have separation of power. You can't be a member of the executive and the legislative, or a member of the executive and the judicial. So Governor Allain, then Attorney General Allain sued, and the courts agreed with him that legislators could not serve on those boards and commissions. So it kind of changed the entire structure of state government in Mississippi, and kind of helped to limit the authority of the legislature at the time. So that was a watershed event, and I guess what he's, from a historical standpoint, as far as policy, what he's best known for, and that occurred while he was Attorney General. Of course, as governor, he actually vetoed the 1987 four-lane highway bill that is viewed as such a crucial legislation in terms of building adequate highways in the state and helping with the economic development. He actually vetoed that bill. That bill passed over his veto. He vetoed at the time. His primary objection was the fact that he felt in doing any type of major legislation like that, he felt that the three-member elected Transportation Commission should become an appointed commission instead of an elected commission. In most states, those, the head of the Department of Transportation is appointed normally by the governor, not elected. So he felt that was a way to go and hinder the state. But of course, the legislature overrode his veto of that bill, and most people credit that bill as being as one of the most significant pieces of legislation to passed over in the 20th century in terms of economic development. People say Toyota wouldn't have come to Northeast Mississippi if Highway 78 had not been 4-lane, and Highway 78 was at least in part 4-lane because of that bill. Mm-hmm. As an example of its importance.
Sure. I'd imagine, we talked about Brandon Presley's role in this, and your story said he's kind of considered Bill Allain as a mentor. He gave the eulogy at Bill Allain's funeral. He's the one you said who talked him into running for mayor for Nettleton and kind of been with him through his public service career. I would imagine also for the artist, Robbie Boyd of Pontotoc, as we mentioned, another Northeast Mississippian who was involved. I mean, that's got to be a pretty big honor too. How does the process work? I guess the governor's usually who picks who does the portrait. Do you know if she has done other gubernatorial portraits in the past, or is this kind of? I'm sure
she does
cool experience for her.
Yeah, this. I mean, she does portraits, and she says she has done some politicians. I think she's in the process of. I hope I'm not. I mean, I didn't put this in the story, and I hope she didn't tell me this in confidence. I don't think she did. So, but I'm going to tell our listeners. I mean, she's in the process right now doing a portrait for Kay Cobb over in Oxford, who is a former member of the state Supreme Court. She's doing her portrait right now, and she's done some other politicians, but she's never done a governor. And of course, I talked to her some about the fact, the difference in doing a portrait of someone who is deceased. She said normally, like if she was doing a portrait of a living person, she'd like to meet with them, kind of see their characteristics, and kind of get their skin tone and their facial features that maybe don't show up all the time in portraits. So, but she didn't have that luxury with Governor Allain, of course. And I guess what stands out the most to me on Governor Allain, and she mentioned this too, is he had his hair was just, I was just totally white, and it had been as long as I can remember when I was growing up. I mean, it was not like that. So, that to me was a feature that stood out the most on him. But, that's not a lot to go up. And
right.
He had I guess he probably had in hindsight, probably had a real light complexion. And so so sometimes those things don't show up in portraits in photographs like you would hope and need for a portrait. But she said she just did the best she could. And Presley, saw that, he actually delivered the portrait to Archives and History, and he praised its authentic nature. And he said it was a good likeness and captured the personality of Governor Allain. We'll all see, I guess, on January 29th.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. Switching gears now, I guess you had a column last week. I guess it was Thursday that it ran. Looking at, we've talked before about the proposed possibility of a vote that was it Senator Kirby had recommended.
Yeah.
Right. The legislature will look at the issue of maybe having a vote for citizens to decide whether or not to raise the gas tax, and maybe doing so to have money for the state's roads and bridges. We've talked before, there's a lot of need for repair there, and there's no consensus on where that money should come from. Anyway, your column, and I'll let you kind of walk us through it, is basically saying that the politics, those who favor having more money for roads and bridges, that maybe this vote may be a dangerous proposition.
Yeah, in a sense, Chris, I guess the people who are most vocal in supporting more money for roads and bridges are kind of in between a rock and a hard place, because the legislators can't agree on where that money is going to come from. Can't reach it, as you said, can't reach a consensus on how to raise that money. So, Dean Kirby, who's a well-respected state senator from and has a good bit of influence, state senator from Pearl, has said he's going to propose during the 2018 session some type of statewide referendum to let people vote on a proposal that would, I guess, include raising the gasoline tax and maybe some other fees. Maybe like on car tires. When you buy a set of car tires, you might pay $5 or something other toward road and bridges, and some other fees like that. But only thing I've said in the column is they need to be careful putting that to the voters, there's been a poll or two that would suggest that maybe that's not the most popular, raising the gasoline tax is not the most popular notion. And if there's a statewide vote and in that vote, that proposal shot down, it's definitely going to be hard to get legislators to agree to raise fees on or taxes to pay for roads and bridges. So it's going to be a tricky proposition. It would be better for the advocates of spending more money on roads and bridges just to keep on plugging away and hope at some point the legislature would acquiesce and agree to raise some of those taxes, or do you go to the public and hope you can get the majority of voters to agree to raise those taxes? And if you don't get that majority vote, how do you, from the voters, do you think the legislators are going to come back after that and raise the gasoline tax? I just don't. That's an unlikely proposition. So, but there's not a good choice, but I don't know if the statewide referendum is the best choice out of a group of bad choices, if you will.
Yeah, and then I guess adding to it too would be the amount of how much you'd ask for in that referendum. The less you ask for, the better chance you have of getting it passed. But as you also wrote, if you don't ask for enough, then you could lead to voters feeling disenchanted a little bit down the road.
Yeah, the voters think they go out and vote to raise the tax to solve a problem, and the amount of money they raise from that tax is not enough to solve that problem. Voters are going to be particularly upset about that, I would think. So and they're not talking about a small amount of money. The Department of Transportation said it needs about $400 million more per year to address all the needs. And that would be a sizable increase in the gasoline tax and other fees to come to that amount. Now, I'm sure that if some amount less than that would also help solve some of the problems for the Department of Transportation. But you want it to be enough to be able for people out driving be able to see the difference in pretty short order. So those are some tough issues for that. And this transportation issue has been a sort of a bouncing around for 3 or 4 years now and just not getting anywhere. And it's if you look at polling, it's becoming more of an issue that the public wants something done, but then the public doesn't want to necessarily pay to get it done. So it's a tough conundrum for the legislators.
All the way around. Yeah, sure. Another thing, Bobby, we talked a good bit last week about Governor Phil Bryant's budget proposal that he released last week. And one of the things, I believe you said it on the show, was that he didn't mention a state lottery. And that kind of stood out because after initially not supporting a lottery, he had kind of begun to do so, including in the budget proposal a year earlier. And maybe I think that was even the first time that he publicly supported it. Anyway, you wondered at the time, whether his lack of mention, meant that he no longer supported the issue, and then kind of followed up with him during the week and wrote a little bit about that. But kind of tell us where he stands now on the issue of a lottery.
Well, to back up what you said, I believe the first time he actually talked about the possibility of supporting the lottery was when he made his budget proposal in 2016, and that was that was big news and kind of a big deal. And the fact that he didn't include any mention of lottery in his budget proposal for that he released not last week but the week before last, that just got me to wondering has he kind of changed his mind again on the lottery. But his position, which I think has been consistent since he first started talking about the lottery, is he wants it to be considered he'd like to see it considered by the legislators, and he reserves the right to not. He said he reserves the right to not sign the lottery bill based on some issues, but in general, I think he would like to see the legislature have a vote on lottery, and I think he would probably support it if the money went just into the general fund or into maybe into roads and bridges. But he does still support a lottery in concept, I guess is the best way to say that.
So it'll be interesting to see. It's another one of those issues with, including the road and bridges that we've talked about a lot, and will be interesting to see anything that happens on that in 2018. I guess the 2018 session is almost here, just over a month away, but believe it or not. So you'll be busy. One more thing that you followed up with Governor Bryant about last week is this idea of a 2% rule, which essentially says that you'd only, or I guess it's a 98% rule, but that you'd only budget 98% of the estimated revenue, and you'd kind of give yourself a little cushion Some years they've done it, some years they haven't, depending on how much revenue they had. But essentially, the governor is recommending that they stick to it this year. Correct?
Yeah, that's actually state law. It's been state law since
right.
Since 92 or 93, somewhere thereabouts. But in recent years, ever since the Great Recession in 2008, that law hadn't been adhered to very often. In most years, they've spent 100% of projected revenue. Now, going into the 2017 session, both the governor and the legislative leadership, were in unison that they should go back to following the law and only appropriate 98% of the revenue. But at the end of the session, when money was tight, they reached a compromise where they actually appropriated 99% instead of 98%. So that gave them, in essence, what that meant is that gave them an extra $55 million, because each 1% of revenue, projected revenue, is about $55 million. So, and now, just today, Chris, the legislative leadership released its budget proposal, and like the governor, they again are calling for reverting back to the original law and only appropriating 98% during the 2018 session. Now we'll see at the end of the session whether they can follow through with the law this time or not. But revenue continues to be tight. But that's their goal, is just to appropriate 98%. And of course, Chris, just the reason they do that is they're projecting how much revenue will come in during the next budget year, which starts July 1st. And that's kind of just an educated guess on their part. So the thought is that you have a little cushion, and the revenue doesn't meet projections. You don't have to make mid-year budget cuts, which are difficult for the agencies because they already planned for the amount of money they're going to have, and they have to come back and make a cut. That proves difficult. So that 98% law is put in place to provide a cushion to prevent those to make those mid-year budget cuts less likely.
Sure. Well, thanks, Bobby, as always, for joining us. And that does it for another episode of Capitol View. We thank you for watching us, and we remind you that you can catch us every Monday at 2 o'clock at djournal.com. If you miss it, check our replay also on the website or on our Facebook page. So have a great week, and we will see you next week.